Okay, this is the information on the cities of the plains, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim. The Bible says that God rained fire and brimstone on those cities and burned them up.
Yes.
And everything you see is crumbly, powdery ashes, but it has brimstone all in the layers of ash. And this is some of the brimstone here in the display case here.
Wow.
When you burn calcium carbonate in the presence of brimstone or sulfur, it produces calcium sulfate ash. And everything you see out there in that area is 100% calcium sulfate. You can see some of the calcium sulfate with unburned pieces of brimstone still stuck in it there.
So this whole piece is
Calcium sulfate. When you burn a limestone, which is what those old Canaanite cities were made out of, in the presence of sulfur, it produces calcium sulfate, and that's what their ashen remains are calcium sulfate.
Oh, okay. When you burn that limestone with the sulfur,
if you took a rock, a limestone rock, and mixed it with sulfur,
okay,
which is brimstone, and burned it, the chemical result would be calcium sulfate.
Got it.
And that's what all this is, but it has unburned pieces of brimstone still all in it.
Oh, okay, got it.
Okay, so it makes perfect sense what happened there.
Oh.
Genesis 10:19 tells you where to look for those cities. It says they were the boundaries of the Canaanites. And so they're scattered out along the western shores of the Dead Sea. We believe this is Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah. Zeboim is actually north of the Dead Sea. In 1 Samuel, it talks about a Philistine army traveling in 3 different directions from Michmash, which was about 20 miles north of Jerusalem. And one part of the army went east toward the valley of Zeboim, and there's still ashen remains there in that area. So it's north of the Dead Sea. The first century historian Josephus said you could still see those cities.
Yeah.
And then in 1928, there was a man by the name of Melvin Kyle. They worked with the famous archaeologist William Albright. Okay. And they went out there and saw this and said that was the remains of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then people forgot about it, and Ron Wyatt went there and found it again. And the Bible says it's to be an example or an ensample for people that would choose to live ungodly lives. Yeah. So it has to be something you can look at, and it's still right out there today.
And it's a big, it goes for miles and miles.
Well, it's separate locations. We believe this is Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim. So it's specific areas where, you're pretty much in desert or area, and then you have certain areas just ash with brimstone in it.
Yes.
So these were separate places.
Yeah, because a few weeks ago I was in Israel, and we drove along the Dead Sea, and there are a lot of these kind of things along the way.
That's right.
And just like you described, one distance to another distance you see, and
So anyway, there's a lot of evidence that what the Bible says is right there to be seen today.
Wow.
All right, let's move on over here to the Red Sea crossing.
Oh, also here, this is the yellow stuff.
That's just what we would find here in our country, sulfur. That's just
sulfur. Okay.
Yeah, that's just an example of what we would expect to find here. But this is just as pure as that, but it's a different form of sulfur. And this is found, we haven't been able to find this anywhere else except at this site. Ron and I went to volcanic areas and mineral museums.
Yeah, we bought that DVD, and it shows the local volcano so far is only 40%, something like that. Not like this, 90-something%.
But this is just as pure as that, but it's a different form of sulfur. And of course, the Bible says that God rained these things out of heaven on those cities. And so He made this sulfur.
God.
Of course, He made that too.
Yeah. But this is specially made.
That's right, special sulfur.
And this is. It just hit the rock, and it still remains inside.
It's just kind of encapsulated. Encapsulated inside this calcium sulfate. Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting about that, if you look at this one, you see it has a shell around it.
Yeah.
And that shell has a lot of iron content in it. And the sulfur inside of it vaporizes before the iron can melt. Okay. In other words, the sulfur will vaporize before the iron gets hard enough to melt.
Okay.
So how did that sulfur stay there while the iron was forming around it? Nobody can explain it. God did it.